Good evening and welcome to the world today. Tonight we're going to discuss the situation in the Arab Peninsula, its links with what else is going on in the Middle East, the chaotic relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the war in the Yemen, the role of Israel, the repression in Turkey. It's a big agenda, and with me is David Hearst, former senior foreign correspondent at The Guardian, but for a number of years now, editor of Middle East Eye, a very informative and valuable website which we can only encourage people to go to for studying the region in more detail. David, welcome.
Thank you.
Tell me first, for some of our viewers who may not be aware of this, that what exactly are the Saudi Arabian government demanding from this tiny principality called Qatar? What do they want?
In a word, the end of their sovereignty.
Yes.
Basically what they're saying is change your foreign policy, cut off the biggest arm of it, which is their funding of Al Jazeera. And we can talk about how Al Jazeera has changed the media landscape in the Arab media world quite significantly, and become like Bahrain, i.e. keep your wealth. You can have as many racehorses as you want at Royal Ascot, but do what we say. And up till now, and again, I'm saying this carefully, Qatar hasn't rolled over. It's actually put two fingers up to Saudi Arabia. There is a big military threat because Qatar is tiny, and all Saudi Arabia has to do is roll its tanks over a border, a very badly defended border. But they have stood their ground so far against really quite considerable opposition. The whole thing kicked off, of course, off a piece of Trump-like fake news. What happened was a few weeks ago, in the middle of the night, the official Qatari website had been hacked and a false speech had been put on the website in the name of the Emir of Qatar, saying all sorts of weird and wonderful things, like we must undermine Saudi Arabia, we must cozy up to Iran, we must cozy up to our friends Israel. Very unlikely things for him to say. This was then reported solidly for 12 hours, as if it was true, by Sky News Arabia, part owned by Murdoch, part owned by the Emiratis, by the Saudi outlets. And then war was declared. There was this huge information barrage against Qatar, saying now Qatar has to be dealt with. This is what they truly believe in. They're undermining our campaign against Iran. So they've accused Qatar basically of funding terrorists. Originally, again, we can go back to this, they accused Qatar of the sin of supporting Hamas. This is a very curious position for the Saudis to adopt because the Saudis were neutral. They had good relations with Hamas. In fact, they even allowed the Shura to meet in Jeddah. They arranged a mediation between Fatah and Hamas at Medina. So suddenly they say, stop supporting Hamas. But when the 13 demands were actually published, Hamas's name was dropped. The reason for this is that one of the placemen of the Emiratis, Mohammed Dahlan, who's a Fatah strongman, to put it mildly, is trying to buy himself an entry visa back into Gaza. And this is a three-way fight between Hamas and two rival factions of Fatah. And the Emiratis were embarrassed by the fact that they were putting pressure, on the one hand, on Hamas, but on the other hand, asking them to bring back Dahlan. And so Hamas disappeared.
David, you say the Saudis could march into Qatar and do what they did to Bahrain. Of course, you're absolutely right. There is one problem. They couldn't do it without US permission and the green light from Washington, Pentagon, White House, because Qatar is also the largest US military base in the region. The Al Udeid military base, which was shifted from Saudi Arabia to Qatar, gave Qatar a regional and global importance. It was from that military base that the Iraq war, the bombing was launched, etc., etc. So the United States would have to agree with this. I mean, leaving aside the fact that Trump in his election campaign said that the Saudis had to be dealt with because the 9/11 attackers all came from Saudi Arabia. Why are we coddling this country? We have to deal with them. And then the minute he's elected, there's a complete turnaround. The Saudis, of course, were preparing for Hillary Clinton to come to office. A lot of money had been given to her campaign. But then they had to deal with Trump. But that didn't take them too long, did it?
No, it didn't. And the actual link man between the Saudis and Trump, and particular Kushner, is Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the mentor of Mohammed bin Salman, the 31-year-old prince who is now the crown prince of Saudi Arabia.
And has key positions in the Saudi government, Minister of Defense.
He's got everything.
Everything.
He's Minister of Defense, he's the crown prince. He's the man in charge of this privatization program.
Including the oil, which must be annoying some of his siblings and cousins.
Absolutely. He has now got all power. And he's pushed out of the way his rival, who is his elder cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef. But the key link man between him and Kushner, and of course the Israelis, is Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the crown prince of Abu Dhabi. He's the commander-in-chief of their forces. He's the guy behind the campaign against the Muslim Brotherhood, behind Qatar. For him, there's one very, very clear enemy in all this, and that is political Islam. And with it, leftist and secular opponents throughout the land. And that is a much, much bigger enemy than Iran, for instance, for him. And that explains the butchery that's going on in Yemen, and it explains a lot of the bombing that's taking place in Benghazi and Libya. It is responsible for a whole swathe of tacit intervention and terrible, terrible human suffering.
Okay, so let's just look at the Middle East now. Since 9/11 and the Iraq War, the Saudis in disfavor after 9/11, totally back in favor again. Iraq is a wrecked country, over 1 million killed in the wars and the occupation, and the casualty figures still going up. Syria is in a terrible state with this civil war. Libya has been completely destroyed and is effectively run by 3 different type of Islamist organizations, thanks to the Saudis, thanks to Qatar, and thanks also to the fact that they regard, on one level, their rivalry with Iran as being so crucial that they have to destroy anything that might stand in the way of Iran being crushed, hence the war in the Yemen. So what the United States has not succeeded in doing is creating anything that could be described even remotely as decent, for all those who were supporters of this wretched exercises. The situation in these countries is much worse, but where the United States has succeeded, especially in Iraq, but also in other parts, is creating this divide between Sunni and Shia, which, of course, brings old issues to the fore, creates new policies, etc. Let's just concentrate on Saudi Arabia for a minute. This young, brash princeling, who is now effectively in charge of the country, from what he says and how he, more importantly, the way he acts, indicates that effectively what they would love is to destroy all their rivals, occupy Qatar or get rid of it as any meaningful entity, and do a long-term private or, at some stage even a public deal with Israel, and say to the Americans, look, it's no longer Egypt now, you have to rely on, that's also in our pocket, by the way, as long as the military is there, but it's a Riyadh, Jerusalem axis. We together will manage the region for you.
Yes, that is a fair summary of what's going on. It is a particularly ruthless project. I mean, this is all about secret operations, money, secret intervention. The word election, democracy, people, leadership, choosing this is all going to be done over the head of the Palestinians. This is another attempt to impose a new leadership on the West Bank and the Palestinians, post-Mahmoud Abbas, having destroyed him as well. Israel is delighted by this project and tacitly supports it. Israel thrives on chaos and dictators around it. I mean, the American foreign policy, it has to be said, is in a turmoil. We talked about the American base in Qatar. There are basically two American foreign policies. There is the clique and the circle around Trump, which includes Kushner, includes Bannon, who's also behind this, and then their Arab friends, which are now Mohammed bin Salman, but also bin Zayed. Very, very few people, a select group of fixers. I'll fix the Middle East for you. Don't worry about it. It's confusing to you, President Trump. Just listen to me. I know the Arabs. I know how to deal with them. And that's the advice he's been given. Then there is the establishment. There is the deep state. Now, for all sorts of reasons that we both know about, we're neither of us two lovers of the American deep state. But in this scenario, in this wild, unstable scenario, they are actually a restraining force, believe it or not. And exactly as you said, it would need their permission, i.e. the permission of the Pentagon and the CIA, for Saudi tanks to roll into Qatar. And of course, they're not going to give it.
They're not going to do that.
And so what you've had over the last few weeks, if you read the statements closely, you've had Trump tweeting, and he tweets, and he says, yeah, right, we're going to crush Qatar, we're going to finish with these guys. And then you have briefings from the State Department say, where's the evidence? So that's been going on, and I have a feeling why I think the military option at the moment is off the table for Saudi Arabia. It could have been in the first few hours. There are indications that there was a coup going on in literally the first few hours when that website was hacked. But I've not got strong evidence for it. It's rumors. I'm trying to chase that story up. However, since then, America hasn't reacted on Saudi's side. I mean, I'm talking about American public opinion. I'm talking about editorials of the good and the great, like the Washington Post and the New York Times, the Guardian, etc. They haven't succeeded in making the case. In fact, quite the opposite. Every single time that they mention a new case, there's a counterexample, and there are many of them.
And the European countries, exactly the same.
Yes.
Telling the Saudis to calm down.
Yes.
This can't be solved.
Particularly the German foreign minister.
Yes.
Who's an interesting player in the whole thing. So it hasn't gone to plan, this particular operation. Now I think what's going to happen is an economic blockade. I think it's going to be a battle between sovereign wealth funds. It's going to be a battle about whether or not they can drag Qatar's economy down. And we'll feed it in London because the Brits are quaking.
Of course.
Because Qatar owns just as much, in fact, probably more than the Queen does in terms of London
Britain.
property. No, in London, in property.
In London.
In London specifically. So
it's not going to suit sort of British interests at all.
Absolutely not. They want both sides to quieten down. Yeah. But the Saudi tactics now is saying, if you invest in us, you've got to disinvest in Qatar. And that's the game they're going to play. I think they're going to have problems. Problems on several fronts. We've mentioned this before. They're privatizing, right? Bin Salman is behind this privatization. But in order to privatize, you actually have to be slightly more transparent about their finances than they have traditionally been. There's in fact a big black hole in Saudi finances. If you look at the figures of the sovereign wealth funds, for instance, firstly you think this is an enormous amount of money, something like 2.8 trillion. So the Arab world doesn't actually need a Marshall Fund. All it needs is to spend that money on the people who actually live there. And that was the big tragedy of the Arab Spring, that the money was in one place and the people were in the other. But secondly, there's a more interesting disparity between the size of Emirati sovereign wealth funds and Saudi sovereign wealth funds.
What is the difference?
Well, it's double. If you look at the figures, it's double. And you'd say, hang on a moment, this doesn't make sense. Saudi controls most of the oil, and the House of Saud controls 30% of that. Why aren't they much wealthier? And the reason is, I think, because they're creaming it off.
The Saudis are creaming it off.
No, the Saudi royal family is creaming it off.
But that we know, it's, a sort of kleptocracy.
Well, I know, completely. But they're doing it at a huge rate. Let me just look at the figures. Something like 200 billion a year is actually being creamed off. So
it is a large family.
It's a very large family. At the last count, 30,000 members. But on the one hand, I'm just mentioning this because on the one hand, they're going to the stock market and they're going to in London and in New York and saying, we want to privatize 5% of Aramco, the state oil fund. And on the other, they've got to hide the fact that
they're stealing all this money.
They're stealing all this money anyway. So they're literally stuck in this position of being a very, very old-fashioned absolute monarchy, and the attempt to sort of reach out to the modern world and say, hey, Saudi Arabia's got to grow up and pay for its way. And in the middle of this, they're launching wars and they're launching these operations. So from America's point of view, these are very, very unstable allies, and they're creating instability. The whole thing about Qatar is creating instability.
Coming to the Palestinians, they've, historically been taking money from any Arab state which is prepared to give it to them. This has been cut down, as we know. The Israelis now effectively control the structures of the PLO. It's a sad, sad story. What more do you think the Israelis want? I mean, surely the PLO has done everything in its power to go on its knees to accept Israeli demands on virtually everything. Dehlan, of course, wants to be even more craven and has been in the past. But I don't think qualitatively it would make that much difference, because the choice in Palestine, as we know, is they're not even going to get a Bantustan. The Israelis won't even give them a fake state, which they can pretend is a real state. So they're just left in the middle of nowhere, with the real choice being a single state with apartheid, which is de facto what it's becoming, or a democratic Israel-Palestinian entity which now appears utopian. So it's a completely messy situation. And then you have Gaza, where Hamas is still in control, but whether they could bring it to heel or not remains to be seen.
Every year in which I continue my current job, I think it's got to get better.
But it gets worse.
Every year it just gets worse, and particularly for the Palestinians. It is an unbearable story. Every time I go back to the West Bank or to Gaza, I see, hey, that wasn't there when I was last here, these twinkling Israeli settlements everywhere. What Israel wants is total dominance of the area from the river to the sea. And that's what they're getting, bit by bit. It's a very, very depressing story. And you have to have great reserves of hope and optimism for the Palestinians, that they can actually pull through this and actually arrive at the only just settlement, which basically, as you said, is a one-state solution. But again, the word utopian is absolutely right. That feels so far away from what we've actually got. So Israel proceeds by knocking out any independent Palestinian leadership, by getting still, even though it's not talking to Abbas, by getting security cooperation, which basically means locking up all of the opposition, torture, night arrests, planting agents. That goes on all the time. And the siege of Gaza goes on brutally over the summer, and this was at the Mahmoud Abbas's request, that the actual total hours of electricity have reduced from 6 hours to 2 hours. And then, of course, conveniently, Mohammed Dakhlan comes across from Cairo and says, hey, I'm going to solve the problem for you. Just let me in and we'll get the fuel trucks over for you. Hamas is split.
On whether to let him in or not.
Yes.
That just shows what a weak position.
And they're in a weak position, and they're struggling with unity at the moment.
And then if you look at the two regional powers, which traditionally have been the big powers in the Muslim world, Egypt and Turkey, both of them are led by elected autocrats. I mean, all the hope that had arisen in Turkey with the big entry into parliament of the HDP, or in Egypt with the emergence of a huge mass movement for liberty. It didn't go beyond that, but for liberty, for democracy, for human rights. That's what that movement both crushed. Torture going on, large-scale arrests, and them then with each of the states having fingers, one in Syria, and the Egyptians now totally backing Saudi initiatives in the Middle East. So there's no independent state as such. So how long, I mean, this will go on, we don't know, and how long will NATO tolerate Turkey doing this?
Well, it's certainly a bleak picture. Nationalism rules the day, and autocrats rule the nationalists. I think there is a qualitative difference between Egypt and Turkey, just purely on the number of deaths and executions and people in prison. But certainly the developments in Turkey are disheartening is an understatement. Since the coup attempt, they've had wholesale purges and very little process or rule of law, and hundreds of thousands of people being chucked out of their jobs and their lives ruined permanently. The end of academic freedom, the end of independent journalism. So this isn't a happy picture.
Even the appallingly repressive military dictatorships didn't go this far. They were horrific in terms of arresting communists and trade unionists and torturing and killing them. But they didn't wreck the academy, if my memory serves me right, to this extent, as Erdogan is doing now. It's to establish his power and his hegemony over all the institutions of the Turkish state.
Yes, I mean, I think the institutions of the Turkish state is a very interesting concept, but I don't think they are anymore. Parliament is a weakened process. All power is put in the hands of the presidency. And it could only be a matter of time before he turns even on his own people, on the AKP. There's a faction of the AKP that want a parliamentary democracy, a strong one that wanted a strong prime minister. They are now being completely shut out. Erdogan wins elections, and he provides schools and roads and an economy, but it is increasingly his persona. And he's thinking 20, 30 years.
Yes,
and he's thinking also of himself as another Ataturk. He's going exactly down the personified
an inverted Ataturk.
Yes, an inverted Ataturk. That doesn't help Turkey. That doesn't develop it. It creates huge polarization. There was a real coup, and he and his family very nearly got wiped out. However, that doesn't justify what's happened.
Do we have any proof and evidence now of who was behind this coup? Erdogan is, of course, blaming his rival Islamist, Fethullah Gulen. And, of course, we know that behind Gulen is the United States. So if he is blaming the coup on the United States, relations must be very tense.
Well, they were extremely tense with fellow NATO members, because there were also quite a few American generals involved, and there were air tickets and communication, evidence of communication prior to the coup between Turkey and America. This is why there has been such heat around an element of the Turkish military that stayed in Germany and wouldn't come back home because they knew they would be arrested. So definitely it involved a rather large section of the Turkish military.
Under NATO command, after all.
Absolutely in the pockets of NATO, and certainly they were the generals that the Americans liaised with. Turkey alleges that Gulen was behind this, and these were Gulenists. And the reason for the widespread crackdown is because of the penetration of the Gulen movement in all facets of the Turkish state.
Well, they were allies, after all.
They were allies, but they ran schools, they ran universities, they ran newspapers, and it is that network that they're taking apart. However, it is essential, even if you have this huge element, that it's proved, that there's evidence for it, that there is a due process, and you're not simply just knocking out anyone who raises genuine political points about your total and absolute rule. And I think this is incredibly unhealthy for the long-term future of Turkey.
David, what about the thorniest question of all, the future of Syria? Where is this going to end up? I mean, at one point, there was some vague hope that there would be an agreement, a national government would be formed, Assad would make some concessions, might leave himself after a while. But that's all gone now. It doesn't seem likely. So what are we going to see in Syria? Effectively an even worse repeat of Iraq, where the country is divided. What is your opinion?
Well, at the moment, the big fight, the fighting is taking place in the east of the country. And that is all about Jordan, Israel, and the fight that Iran is having to keep the supply lines open to Hezbollah. What they're doing is fighting over the post-ISIS map. But it's a very, very bleak map. Aleppo is completely destroyed.
But is back in government hands?
But is back in government hands. There are Syrians returning from Turkey to rebel-held areas. That's a movement involving tens of thousands, which is interesting. Because you would say there's nothing for them to return to, but they are still returning to it. I think what you're going to see is a patchwork country, which will be divided among and between ruling factions. And it's not going to be a united country for a very long, long time. It's going to take much, much longer than Lebanon did to recover from this. So basically what you need at the moment is a ceasefire. Curiously, the people who are most interested in securing that ceasefire are the Russians, because the Russians want out. They don't want an extended engagement to get stuck in there. And Iran would also do it. So if there were two countries that I would actually look at for ideas and for means and mechanisms, it wouldn't be Western countries. They would be those two countries. From a Syrian point of view, I think it's a massive tragedy. This is a total disaster, and I read one estimate that it would require $200 billion just to even start the reconstruction. And no one's got $200 billion. No one's
the Saudis have, as we know.
Well, of course, the Saudis have, but they invest it in themselves, or in us, actually.
Yeah, exactly, and other Western countries. David, on that sad note, we must bring this conversation to an end. Lovely talking to you, very informative, and we will speak again. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.